Hey there friends, Andrea Walford here from Make Beautiful Cards. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this beautiful day card featuring products from Stampin' Up's Beautiful Autumn Suite. So I have here a scrap piece of very vanilla cardstock, and the first thing I'm going to do is stamp the acorn and the leaf image from the Beautiful Autumn stamp set using Early Espresso Classic ink. Now I'm going to be stamping 2 of the acorn, and then I'm going to be stamping 2 of the leaf image. Now, as you see, I stamped one leaf image in one direction and the other in the other direction, and that's simply to make the most of my cardstock space. Now, my next step is going to be to color these images, and for that, I'm going to be using my Stampin' Blends. For the top of my acorns, I'm going to be using my light cinnamon cider and the dark cinnamon cider. So my first step is to use the bullet tip of my light cinnamon cider and to color in a single layer of the acorn top. Then with the bullet tip of the dark cinnamon cider, I'm coloring in along the left and right edges and along the bottom of that top piece. Next, I'm taking the brush tip of my light cinnamon cider and blending out just the edges of the dark. And then I'm going to take the dark cinnamon cider and just add a second layer at the very far left and right edges and along the very bottom. Now for the bottom portion of my acorn, I'm going to be using light and dark Cajun Craze. Because my area is quite small, once again, I'm working with the bullet tip of my marker. And it's easiest to apply color along the inner edges and then to color in the center area of the bottom pieces. So after adding a single layer of the light Cajun Craze with the bullet tip, I'm adding some of that dark Cajun Craze, pretty much outlining along the inner area of that acorn. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the brush tip of the light light Cajun Craze and just blend out the edges of the dark. Finally, I'm going to go back in with the brush tip of my dark Cajun Craze marker and just add a little extra shadowing along the left and right edges and just below the top of that acorn. Now, the 2 sets of leaves I'm also going to be coloring with my Cajun Craze Stampin' Blend marker, the light one. I'm just adding a single layer, and because the area is fairly small, just to make sure I can get into those small spaces without running over the edges, I'm using the bullet point tip. Now, using the bullet point tip of the dark Cajun Craze marker, I'm now going to add a little bit of shading at the very bottom of each leaf and then along the right-hand edge. I'm pretty much following along with the lines on the stamped image, which they have on there, which kind of denotes where the shaded area should be. Now, after adding my shading along that left-hand edge of each leaf, I'm then going in once again with my light Cajun Craze marker, the brush tip, and then just blending out the very edge of that dark Cajun Craze marker. My next step now is going to be to punch and fussy cut the images. So the acorn comes with a coordinating punch from the Autumn Punch Pack, and as you can see, I'm positioning the window of the punch facing upwards, aligning my image in the center of that window, and then punching it out. Now for the leaves, I'm going to be fussy cutting them, and to make it easier to fussy cut, as you can see, I cut it away from the larger cardstock piece. I'm using a fine tip pair of scissors, and I want to leave about 1/16 of an inch border all around the image. Now I do have a full YouTube video that shares some tips for fussy cutting, and it's called How to Fussy Cut Like a Pro, so I won't go into any details here in this video. So my next step now is going to be to create my greeting. So I'm using the bottom straight edge of that rectangular scrap of very vanilla cardstock that I was working on, and I'm positioning it onto the mat in my Stamparatus. Now, to hold it in place, in addition to the 2 magnets, as you can see, I also placed a small piece of low-tack Scotch tape. Now I'm placing the stamp along the bottom right-hand edge of my cardstock piece for placement, and then closing the door of my Stamparatus to pick it up. Then I'm inking it up in my Early Espresso Classic ink and carefully closing the door of my Stamparatus, and there you see I have a perfectly stamped image. So next I want to trim this into a greeting strip. So for that I'm using my small guillotine trimmer, just positioning it in that trimmer, kind of eyeballing it, and then trimming it, and finally I'm just trimming off the excess that was at the left side of the image. So there you can see I have my sentiment strip. So my next step now is to do a little bit of die cutting, and I'm going to be using my Autumn Essentials dies. I'm using that long strip and then 2 of the wheat stalks that come in that die set. Now there I have some brushed metallic cardstock. It's the copper pattern, and I'm just sticking down my dies to hold them in place and then die cutting them. So there you can see my 2 die cut pieces. Next, I'm going to take my subtle 3D embossing folder and a strip of very vanilla cardstock. You want to make sure the strip is at least 2 inches by 4.5 inches. So now I'm going to take that long strip that's from my Autumn Essentials dies, and I'm going to position it along the very bottom of my embossed cardstock strip. And I'm going to hold it in place with some low-tack tape so it doesn't shift as I'm die cutting. So I'm just going to set that aside for a moment, and I'm going to grab the other pieces that we're going to need for this card. So my card base is a 4¼ by 5.5 inch Cajun Craze note card. I have a 4 by 5¼ inch piece of early espresso cardstock, a 3 7/8 by 5 1/8 inch piece of patterned paper. I have a mint macaron strip. It's smaller than 1/4 inch and it's 3 1/4 inches long. I have a copper piece that's 1/2 inch by 3.5 inches, and I have a 3/4 inch by 4 inch piece of striped pattern paper. Now I also have a 3/4 inch by 4.5 inch piece of Cajun Craze cardstock. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to center and stick my pattern paper piece onto my early espresso cardstock. And for that, I'm just going to be using some double-sided adhesive. So next I want to trim my embossed and die cut very vanilla cardstock strip, and I want to trim it to 1.5 inches by 4 1/8 inch. And for that, I'm going to be using my guillotine style trimmer. So now it's time to start sticking my various strips together. So I'm going to start with my striped pattern paper piece, the 3/4 inch by 4 inch piece, and I want to stick it to the back of my Cajun Craze cardstock strip. So remember, that strip is 3/4 inch by 4.5 inches. Next, I want to take my very vanilla cardstock strip and I want to stick it down to my Cajun Craze cardstock strip. And I want to make sure that the left edges of both pieces are aligned. And I want the bottom edge of that very vanilla cardstock strip to be about 1/8 inch up from the bottom edge of the Cajun Craze cardstock piece. And now I want to stick this onto my matted pattern paper piece. And I'm positioning it so that the left edge of that very vanilla piece is aligned with the left edge of the pattern paper piece. And I want the bottom edge of the Cajun Craze piece to be about 3/4 inch up from the bottom edge of that matted panel. So now I'm going to take my 1/2 inch by 3.5 inch strip of my brushed metallic copper piece, and using an acrylic graph ruler, I want to stick it over top of that very vanilla cardstock strip so that it's about 1/8 inch up from the top edge of that die cut pattern and about 1/8 inch in from the right hand edge. Next, I'm going to prep my greeting strip, and I'm just going to do that by placing some mini Stampin' Dimensionals across the back of that little greeting piece. My next step is to place some of my double-sided adhesive along the back of that little mint macaron strip. Remember, it's 3 1/4 inches long and it's just under 1/4 inch high. And using my ruler to help me with placement, I'm sticking it so that the bottom edge of the mint macaron strip is aligned with the top edge of that copper piece, and the right-hand edge of that strip is about 1/8 inch in from where that copper strip ends. Now I'm going to place my greeting down, but I'm only removing the Stampin' Dimensionals at the back of the words "A Beautiful Day." I'm leaving the backing of the Stampin' Dimensional where it's positioned at the back or behind the word "Have," and that's so that I can lift the edge of my greeting strip up to tuck my little die cut piece underneath. So as you can see, I've used some of my liquid glue on the back of my die cut piece, and I'm just positioning it so it's slightly tucked behind the greeting. I'm going to be placing the second die cut piece to the left so it looks like they're kind of bending away from each other, and I'm also going to be using some liquid glue for that. Now, After positioning them in place, I didn't want the bottom edge of that die cut piece to extend down so far, so I decided to trim it using my paper snips. And then from there, I aligned it with the left edge of that first die cut piece and then stuck it down pretty much on top of that first die cut piece. Now for that little tri-leaf piece that you see, I'm also using some liquid glue, and I'm just lifting up the edge of my greeting. So again, I want to tuck it behind the word have on my little greeting strip, and then I'm just sticking that in place. Now initially I was going to leave the bottom hanging down, but I decided to trim it a little bit so I could hide it behind the acorns that I'm going to be sticking down later. Now for my second leaf piece, I trimmed the end of it, and then to stick it down, rather than using my liquid glue, I decided to use a mini glue dot. So I'm just taking a mini glue dot and placing it at the back of that largest leaf, and then I'm sticking it, as you can see here, so that the tip is slightly extending over the left-hand edge of that matted cardstock piece. So now I'm just going to go ahead and place some Stampin' Dimensionals on the back of my acorns, and the first acorn I'm going to be sticking over top of the left-hand edge of my greeting. First though, I removed the backing of the Stampin' Dimensional so that I could stick down that remaining little bit of my greeting strip. Now for my acorn, I decided to switch up that larger Stampin' Dimensional for a mini one because I wanted my acorn to slightly overlap the left edge of the greeting strip, but I wasn't able to do that with the larger Stampin' Dimensional. So after swapping out my Stampin' Dimensional, I stuck my first acorn down, and then you can see my second acorn I tucked under the edge of that first acorn. So now I'm ready to stick that panel down onto my note card front, and for that I'm just using some of my double-sided adhesive on the tape runner. So my final step now is to embellish my card with a few rhinestones, and I'm using the Champagne Rhinestone Basic Jewels. And initially I placed a cluster of 3 jewels towards the top right of that very vanilla piece. I then placed one on my acorn, another one just a little bit to the right of the leaves, and then I decided that I actually didn't want any of my rhinestone jewels along the right hand side of that strip. So as you can see, I'm just removing them and I'm clustering them around that area where I have my acorns and leaves. So there you have it, friends. Our card is now finished. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and I look forward to creating with you again soon. See ya!